9 U.S. Presidents Assassinated by Globalists by Larry Engel. And I keep the name 9, N-I-N-E, so it's easier for people to look up, even though now I claim that more than 20 presidents and other leaders were assassinated by the globalists, by the same people for the same reason, to take over the credit of the nation. This is Article 21 about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Most people have come to rely upon the history that you find in history books, but there is a problem there. It seems that our history has been changed by academia, by the history professors at the universities, and by the publishers, to conceal the power of the financial industry, to conceal the power of the banking cartel. In 700 AD, the bankers learned that they could conquer a nation by simply taking over the credit of that nation. A European banking cartel that call themselves Jews but are not have provided large money grants through nonprofit foundations to authors and publishers in order to alter our history. Real Jews worship God. Instead, these people worship money and credit. They sin. Everything you think you know about history may be void of the facts that pertain to the power machinations of this ruthless banking cartel and their agenda to gain and retain hold of the nation's credit.
The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system, which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators, was probably the prime cause of the revolution, said Benjamin Franklin, founding father, constitutionalist, patriot, nationalist and anti-globalist.
You will find it very fruitful to follow the basic idea of this Franklin quote in your own research. But this is beyond the time limits of this report. The motive behind the assassination of Lincoln was to divide the nation. Lincoln prevented this with his debt-free greenback dollars. Good lesson we need to learn for today. The greenback dollars paid for his army, and paid for his navy, and kept the nation alive. There was not a debt associated with it because he had not borrowed the money from the bankers at sometimes 24% they talk about. But the banking cartel in Europe imposed a government on the southern states. This government was called the Confederacy. It really had very little to do with the southern states. It was a European government that had been imposed over the southern states by the banking cartel and by their wealth. This was against the best interest of the people of the South. It did not benefit them at all. And had the North lost the war to the South, the question is, would the South then have won? No, the South and the North, if the South had won the Civil War, would have become part of something called the Golden Circle. The Golden Circle was to include the Caribbean, parts of South America, all of Central America, and Mexico, where Maximilian was the Emperor of Mexico. He was the brother of the Austrian Emperor. So this was a European trick to divide the United States and to take over. Slavery was a very important issue that raised people's anger and divided the nation. That was important about slavery, but the purpose of even that was to divide the nation. get rid of the government of the people, for the people, and by the people, and have one ruled by an emperor of royal title? The banking cartel is a world empire ruled by a tiny elite that are wealthy Jews. Opposed to this Jewish form of government is our government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Judah Benjamin, a Jew, a Rothschild agent, was the dictator of the Confederacy and held the Confederate treasury in his own personal bank account in London. The Confederate government did not represent the best interests of the people of the South. Another Jewish financier, August Belmont, operated in the North, in New York. He was a crypto-Jew. A crypto-Jew is one who disguises that he is a Jew, so his evil acts will not reflect badly on other Jews. His real name was Schoenberg, and he was also a Rothschild agent. These financiers, along with those in Europe, conspired to assassinate Lincoln.
Quote, "It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." End quote. Times of London. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs. Thomas Jefferson.
Now we have a quote here about the banks by Thomas Jefferson. Was Thomas Jefferson wrong? You know, if we have a standing army, we have airplanes and cannons and machine guns and hand grenades and all that. Would that be more dangerous to the nation than the banks? We drive by the banks every day. They don't jump out and bite us. So what does Jefferson talk about when he says the banks are more dangerous than hand grenades and machine guns and artillery and jet planes and atomic bombs? What is Jefferson talking about? Is Jefferson wrong? Is he crazy? Maybe not, because what happens when a politician runs for office? What does he ask for? He doesn't ask for bombs. He asks for money so he can buy ads so that he can reach the American people and talk to them. So what happens is the banking cartel takes over all the credit of the nation. And by doing so, all the politicians must go on their knees to certain places that are secretly controlled, even they don't know, by the banking cartel that has taken over all the nation's credit. Other than Jewish revenge and Talmud prescripts, the reason and motive behind the assassination of Lincoln at the end of the Civil War was the president's effort to forgive the South and to reunite the nation. Lincoln's plan was called Reconstruction. This is likely also the motive behind the attempt to impeach the next president, Andrew Johnson, who was very sympathetic towards the South. The bankers wished to break the country into two weakened parts, not have it reunited after the war. It is quite interesting to note that Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, played a major role in both Lincoln's assassination and also later when President Johnson attempted to remove Stanton from office, America's first impeachment against a president. Stanton may have just hated the South as it was his war enemy. Many people were feeling that way during the Civil War. They hated each other for no reason. Well, I call it no reason. And therefore, Stanton became an easy tool of the wealthy, powerful bank criminals who wanted really to wreck the nation and to keep it divided. I witness that the most reliable source for information about the events surrounding the assassination of Lincoln is Brigadier General Lafayette Curry Baker, who at times reported directly to President Lincoln.
Although undertaking certain critical military missions as a secret messenger, Brigadier General Lafayette Curry Baker's main efforts were against subversive activities in the vicinity of the district and in the large cities of the East Coast. These included trading with the enemy, fraud by government contractors, enlistment fraud, disloyalty by postmasters, the Confederate spies and sympathizers, disloyal organizations, arrest of fugitives, the most important of which was John Wilkes Booth, and, rather surprisingly, vice in the capital. A quote from the encyclopedia.
This is also taken from the encyclopedia. The conspiracy was larger and more desperate than generally realized. Booth decided to kill the president with the more elaborate kidnapping schemes unraveled. Or maybe that was the plan from the beginning, to assassinate the president. It was just a trick to induce the senators and the Secretary of War when they called it a kidnapping. The real John Wilkes Booth was secretly taken by the detectives, where he killed himself. Baker and an assistant buried the body secretly under the paving stones of a fortress of the old penitentiary. And then his body was dug up and moved to the real grave of Booth. So it really is Booth in the grave, but he didn't quite die the way the history books tell us he did. At this time, General Baker also retrieved Booth's diary and his coat. There was 18 pages documenting the way that Booth had conspired with what were called the Radical Republicans and Mr. Secretary of War Stanton, and also told about their conspiracy to kidnap Lincoln.
General Baker died in 1868, supposedly from meningitis. As it was scarcely 18 months after his explosive allegations that he had proof that Secretary of War Stanton and others conspired to first kidnap then to assassinate Lincoln, he was killed by the War Department to silence him. Using an atomic absorption spectrophotometer to analyze several hairs from Baker's head, Ray Aneef, a professor at Indiana State University, determined the man was killed by arsenic poisoning rather than meningitis. A quote from the encyclopedia.
While serving as an employee of the government, Baker obeyed orders and promptly served his immediate supervisors, one of which was Stanton, of course. But as a private citizen, after he had been relieved of duty by President Johnson, his only obligation was to tell the truth. He knew too much, he told the true facts, and so they murdered him. So Baker who had Booth's diary, ends up being killed with arsenic poisoning when he makes the accusation that the Secretary of War Stanton, some senators, and those financiers, both in Europe and in the United States, had conspired to kill Lincoln. It was in the diary.
The Encyclopedia definition of Reconstruction. From 1863 to 1865, Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson took toned-down positions designed to bring the South back to normal as quickly as possible, while the radical Republicans, as they called themselves, used Congress to block their moderate approaches, impose harsh terms, and upgrade the rights of the freedmen, or former slaves. Wikipedia.
Abraham Lincoln vetoed these harsh bills that the Congress had passed against the South. Both presidents were against these kind of bills. These kind of bills that would have divided the nation was harmful to the South. And the radical Republicans have become the bankers' men because of the diary and other evidence that they conspired to kidnap Lincoln. So they got trapped. General Baker's Secret Service was not today's Treasury Department Secret Service. Today's Secret Service does protect presidents from certain threats. But in my opinion, more accurately, the Secret Service holds presidents as captives for the banking cartel. Actions taken by the Secret Service in the JFK assassination and the Reagan faked assassination raise serious questions about the loyalty of today's Secret Service. The Secretary of Treasury today has very close ties to the European banking cartel. In some cases, he's even registered as a foreign agent. I don't think the Secretary of Treasury today represents the people. I think he represents the European banking cartel. General Baker's Secret Service was an arm of the War Department, the office of the Provost Marshal in Washington, D.C. His superior was Secretary of War Stanton, the conspirator, the man that Baker would later say assassinated Lincoln along with his conspirators. General Baker served on a need-to-know basis with limited knowledge of the overall politician and bankers conspiracy. It appears this highly skilled investigator knew a great deal more than they thought he did. The conspiracy to kidnap or assassinate President Lincoln originated in the Jewish banking houses in Europe, Sachs, Coburg, Gotha, Warburg, and Rothschild, and others. This order was transmitted to their Jewish agents in America. That would be Judah Benjamin, tyrant and dictator of the Confederacy, the French Lazard brothers, André Larrey and Simon, and also August Schoenberg Belmont.
August Belmont Sr., a crypto-Jew, lived from December the 8th, 1813 to November the 24th, 1890. He was a 19th-century German-American politician, financier, foreign diplomat, and party chairman of the Democratic National Committee during the 1850s. He was named the Consul General of the Austrian Empire at New York City, representing that imperial government's affairs in the major American financial and business capital.
August Belmont's wife's uncle, John Slidell, was a Skull and Bones assassin operating out of New Orleans along with General Albert Pike, originator of the KKK. They had assassinated President William Henry Harrison, President Zachary Taylor, President James Polk, and compromised President James Buchanan by poisoning him at his inauguration and then giving him the antidote. Slidell was also a secessionist U.S. senator. There were close links and coordination between banking interests and agents across the lines in both the North and the South. These assassinations were reported in a deathbed confession and covered in some of my other blogs, other videos. Now here is a very interesting quote about our history, the history that you're familiar with. It comes from Otto Edward Leopold, Prince of Bismarck, the Duke of Lauenburg, where he revealed information concealed by history book publishers, editors, and professor authors. The information was concealed from who? The American public. So he is a very famous, well-versed European who says that the American public in history books was not told the whole story, as I said in the beginning of this video.
Simply known as Otto von Bismarck, he was a conservative German statesman who dominated European affairs from the 1860s to his dismissal in 1890 by Emperor Wilhelm II. He was interviewed by CSAM in La Vie, France, on March 1921, where he revealed information concealed by history book publishers, editors, professors, and authors, from the American people. Quote, "The division of the USA, turning brother against brother, into North and South warring factions, was planned by the European banking cartel long before the Civil War. Their motive and their accurate projection was that America would become a world power and compete against their closely held corporate business monopoly, if Americans were allowed to achieve financial independence. These bankers had an overpowering fear of the total passing of their rule, which even today is harbored in a small, insane elite. They feared their power would pass into the hands of representatives chosen by the vote of the people." End quote, from the Encyclopedia.
The government of the people, by the people, and for the people made these bankers scream, pull out their hair, and quiver and shake in their boots. Many U.S. presidents came from very humble beginnings in early life. They weren't aristocrats or have titles of nobility or anything like that. They didn't grow up in a castle, but in a log cabin. The Rhodes Round Table, and Fabian Society also, who has a wolf in sheep's clothing as a symbol, have funneled money through nonprofit foundations to academic authors and historians and to publishers of history books and college texts and university texts and even high school texts. And the idea is to conceal and cover up the bankers' conspiracy. There is a clear report of this by Norman Dodd found on YouTube. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, Senator Benjamin F. Wade, and Senator John Conness, and I'm sure others, were enlisted by the Jewish financiers to delay and stop Lincoln's Reconstruction, the rejoining of the North and South. They planned to kidnap Lincoln in order to achieve this. Assassin Booth recorded the details of the conspiracy in his diary. And Lincoln then could be hidden away when he's kidnapped and removed from office because he couldn't do his job if he's kidnapped. But our Academia history, or college history, doesn't seem to tell us about this part of it.
Booth's diary indicated that Secretary of War Stanton's group, including Senators Wade and Connors, provided Booth with money and information on Lincoln's movements. After several abortive attempts, Booth was ordered to halt his efforts in March 1865, and made no further attempts to kidnap Lincoln, but secretly resolved to murder him instead.
It is likely that General Baker was providing Booth, through the conspirators probably, with false information about Lincoln's movement. That's why they couldn't kidnap him. On the day of the assassination, the president's bodyguard, under the authority of the Secretary of War Stanton, was enjoined to leave his post at Ford's Theater, opening the route for the assassin, making it possible to shoot Lincoln. Once the president was murdered, how are the Jewish bankers going to cover up their conspiracy? Ensure that they are not implicated. Booth, the assassin, knows too much. He even has a diary of the whole history of the event, maybe to protect himself. His diary contains information dealing with meetings with the Stanton group. The real John Wilkes Booth is tracked down. He kills himself. He is secretly buried. His jacket and diary retrieved and turned over to Secretary of War Stanton. For this, Colonel Baker was promoted to general and given a large share of the $100,000 reward. In the meantime, a Confederate prisoner of war who closely resembles the assassin Booth in appearance is ordered released from prison by Secretary of War Stanton on February 14, 1865. His name is Captain James William Boyd. His wife has died, leaving 7 orphaned children. But after being released, their father disappears. He does not return to his family and is never seen again. The Union cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty, believing that they are tracking Booth, corner Confederate Captain Boyd, holed up in a barn in Garrett's Farm, about 70 miles south of Washington, D.C. Boyd is shot and killed by Sergeant Boston Corbett. Detective Everton J. Coger and General Baker, both at the scene, report the misidentification to Secretary Stanton. Witnesses at the scene say the body has a red mustache. Booth had shaved off his brown mustache in order to disguise himself during the escape. Later, Admiral G.W. Beard, aboard the Montauk monitors a ship, right? Navy ship, in the Washington Navy Yard, falsely identifies the body of Boyd as that of the assassin Booth. The body of Confederate officer Boyd was then dumped in a pit that was used, it was a lime pit, and it was used to dispose of the bodies of dead horses, which there were quite a few in that day. This act conceals any connection between Booth, his diary, the kidnapping, the money, the information provided, the plotting politicians, and the banker conspirators. Of course, photos of the body were taken, but they disappeared after being placed in the hands of the War Department. Stanton, aware of the mistaken identity, allegedly saw to it that the autopsy records were altered to remove or obscure descriptions of the body not consistent with Booth. Booth's diary, now in Stanton's personal possession, is said to have 18 pages of incriminating references removed. With the death of Lincoln, Secretary of War Stanton takes control to make a rapid trial and executions, concealing the Jewish bankers' conspiracy in the process. The people convicted, hanged, or sent to prison are all small fry, fall guys who had little to gain from the president's assassination. None of them were bankers or politicians. General Baker announced that he had Booth's diary in his possession, which was being suppressed by the Department of the War and Secretary Stanton. 18 pages of that diary were missing. For telling the truth, Baker is assassinated. Conspirator Stanton claims he too was a victim of the plot. However, Michael O'Laughlin, according to witnesses, was not fulfilling his suspected assignment of assassinating Stanton, but was instead drinking at the Romans Hotel.
Quote, most strikingly, from the time of their arrest until midway through their trial, all the prisoners except Mary Surratt and Dr. Mudd, under orders from Secretary Stanton, were forced to wear canvas hoods that covered the entire head and face. End quote. The encyclopedia. What would they have written or said in their defense, if the hoods had not been forced upon them? All the evidence against them was indirect and circumstantial in nature. For example, Mary Surratt had a picture of the famous actor Booth, and the actor had rented a room in her public boarding house. Therefore, she was found guilty of murder and hanged.
According to Secretary of Navy Gideon Welles, who favored trial in a civilian court, Stanton said, it was his intention that the criminals should be tried and executed before President Lincoln was even buried.
Edward Bates, Lincoln's former Attorney General, was among those objecting to a military trial, believing that such an approach to be unconstitutional, and surely it was. Instead of a 12-man jury of their peers, Stanton arranged a 9-person military commission that he, as Secretary of War, controlled. Conviction would come upon a simple 5-person majority vote, and the majority of 2/3, that would be 6 people, could impose the death sentence. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt served in the problematic dual roles of the chief prosecutor and also legal advisor to the 9-member commission who were to judge the case. The judge's legal advisor was the prosecutor. Of the 371 witnesses, few knew anything at all about the actual assassination. Instead, the War Department saw the trial as an opportunity to prosecute not only 8 charged conspirators, but also the already dead Booth, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and the Confederate Secret Service. Of course, they didn't think anything of Judah Benjamin, the real dictator who controlled the South's purse. Prosecutors suggested that as the war turned in the favor of the federal government, the Confederacy became increasingly willing to support dubious enterprises that would have been rejected under less desperate circumstances. So what would those be?
Witnesses told of Confederate plots to destroy public buildings, burn steamboats, poison the public water supply of New York City, offer commissions to raiders of northern cities, blow up a federal prison, starve Union prisoners of war, and even mount a biological attack. This from the encyclopedia.
The defendants knew nothing of these plots, nor was there evidence that they were individually involved in any of them. The defendants were also accused of the biological attack, deaths of 2,000 citizens and soldiers during a yellow fever outbreak. It was discovered 40 years later, in 1901, that mosquitoes, not people, cause yellow fever. So these people are supposed to be on trial for assassinating Lincoln, and they're accused of biological warfare using yellow fever. Interesting. It is reported that the government had witnesses that were paid, and that parts of the trial transcript simply was altered and changed. The fall guys were convicted. The fall guys were not any kind of powerful people. They were just little people. They were certainly not bankers. Now, does that sound like the Warren Commission or the investigation of 911? That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? These bankers get away with this because they control the bar associations. Bar associations have been associated with insurance companies and bankers and large corporation monopolies for a very, very long time. And if a prosecutor was to prosecute 9/11 or the Kennedy assassination, as did Garrison attempt, he would be disbarred or slandered and smeared, as Garrison was. So, what is a nation's credit? Is it the faith in the ability of the people? The quality of the people of a nation? We now have an unconstitutional fourth branch of government called the Federal Reserve. It's more powerful than the president. It's more powerful than Congress. It's more powerful than courts, all three put together. The Federal Reserve Bank does not serve the general welfare of the nation. That's a requirement of the Constitution. And that's part of the reason why it's illegal. There's other reasons. Why do they get away with it? Why are the Jewish bankers untouchables? This power is invisible. We know, via secret loans to protagonists, the Fed creates money out of nothing. They turn the nation inside out against itself. This series, taken as a whole, proves that President Wilson did sign the Federal Reserve Act against his will. Because there's quotes that show that he didn't approve of this. Why would he sign a bill that he doesn't approve of? He was forced to sign because he knew the banking cartel would murder him and his family. What evidence of that found in this series of reports? At the time, right around the signing of the Federal Reserve Act, we find that Presidents Garfield and McKinley and Benjamin Harrison were assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt was shot. After the Federal Reserve Act was passed, Warren G. Harding was murdered and Calvin Coolidge's son was killed. They got away with it. Because the president signed a bill in which, if he feared for his life, if he didn't, the Federal Reserve Act is unconstitutional.